This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Emma Monroe was the kind of girl who could slip through a crowd unnoticed. At 17, she had become almost invisible, a featureless face in a sea of loud voices, cliques, and colorful personalities that made up the hallways of West Chicago High School. With long dark hair that she often wore in an unkempt ponytail, and eyes that were always slightly downcast, Emma blended into the background. Her face, without makeup, was a canvas of neutrality. There was no shimmer, no sparkle, no defining trait that set her apart from the countless other teenagers who shuffled from class to class, lost in their own private worlds. She was neither ugly nor particularly attractive, just ordinary in the way that felt suffocating. She wore baggy hoodies that swallowed her slender frame, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers that hadn't seen a good cleaning in years. Her clothes were never chosen with care. There was no need to impress anyone. She didn't have friends who complimented her outfit choices or teased her for the wrinkled shirts she would wear day after day. Emma didn't care enough to keep up with trends, let alone try to fit into the high school social scene. If you asked her classmates about Emma, most would struggle to describe her. A few would recall her quiet demeanor, the way she would sit alone in the back of the classroom with her head down, scribbling something in a notebook or staring blankly out the window. She had never been a part of any friend group, and she rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary. Even in group projects, she was relegated to the background, never the leader, never the one others turned to for help, just another face in the room. She didn't mind this, not at first. It was easier this way. Easier not to draw attention to herself. Easier to stay hidden in plain sight. Emma's silence was often misinterpreted as shyness, but it was more than that. It was a shield, one that kept the world at arm's length. It was a self-imposed distance, a barrier to avoid the constant onslaught of laughter, of whispers, of eyes that always seemed to be judging her every move. She had learned early on that if she stayed quiet enough, if she stayed small enough, no one would bother her, and if no one noticed her, no one could hurt her. But the truth was, Emma wasn't shy. She wasn't the type to blush when she spoke to someone or fumble with her words when answering a question in class. She simply had no desire to engage. To her, people were nothing but distractions. Loud, arrogant, cruel distractions that went about their lives as if nothing in the world mattered more than their own existence. But she saw them, their smiles, their jokes, their friendship. She saw the way they moved through life with such ease, the way they got everything handed to them on silver platters. And she wondered, not for the first time, why no one saw her. Emma had learned to bury her feelings beneath a quiet, stoic mask. Her anger was internalized. Her loneliness was her own to carry. She didn't cry for attention. She cried when no one was around to see. Her bitterness festered in secret, turning inwards like a cancer, growing stronger with each passing day. She had seen enough to know that no one cared. No one had ever cared, not in the way she needed. Her father had been distant, locked away in his garage for hours at a time, fixing cars or tinkering with things he could never quite finish. Her mother had been absent, emotionally and physically, lost in a haze of alcohol and antidepressants, unable to offer the love or support Emma craved. There was no safe place for her at home, only silence, punctuated by the occasional argument that filled the house with tension and resentment. And so, Emma grew up in isolation. She never asked for help. She never sought out sympathy. She learned to carry her weight alone, to put up with the teasing and the cruel jabs from her classmates. She internalized the insults, the laughter, the whispers behind her back. It was always the same, the way they called her a freak, the way they snickered when she stuttered or misstepped in gym class. They didn't understand her. They couldn't. How could they? Emma had long ago given up trying to explain herself. She had long ago stopped fighting back. It was easier to just let them have their fun, to let them feel superior. After all, they were the ones who held the power. They were the ones who ruled the school, and she was just a pawn in their game. But there were cracks in the facade. Deep down, Emma knew she wasn't powerless. She had seen enough of the world to know how things worked. She had seen how people who got attention were treated differently. How the loud, the outrageous, the dangerous people who made waves were remembered. Everyone else faded into the background, just like her. But those who stood out, those who demanded attention, were never forgotten. They had power, and Emma had begun to realize that power was something she could wield. It was during one of her late-night internet binges that Emma discovered a darker side of fame. She had stumbled upon forums and videos that discussed extreme acts of rebellion, of destruction, of power. Mass shootings, school bombings, and other forms of violence. They weren't the kinds of things that made her feel afraid, though. Instead, they made her feel something else, an unsettling, magnetic pull. These were people who had taken their frustration, their pain, and turned it into something the world couldn't ignore. They had forced the world to see them, even in death. They were legends in their own right. Emma wondered what it would feel like to be remembered in such a way. For weeks, she scrolled through dark corners of the internet, watching video after video, reading articles, immersing herself in the details of the people who had carried out these acts. She studied them with a focus and determination that surprised even her. What had driven them to the point of no return? What had made them cross the line? What had given them the courage to take such extreme actions? In her mind, it wasn't about violence for the sake of violence. It was about control. It was about making a statement that could not be ignored, a statement that would resonate long after the event itself. It wasn't about killing it, was about being seen. It was about forcing the world to take notice of her. And for the first time, Emma felt like she had found a way out, a way to escape her prison of silence and invisibility. The world was full of noise. The world was full of people who shouted to be heard, people who demanded attention, people who were never overlooked. They were the ones who shaped reality, who got to write their own stories. Emma had been ignored for too long. She had been small for too long. And now, the quiet storm that had been building inside her for years was ready to break. Emma had always been able to handle the endless whispers, the occasional shove, the careless, cruel words that came her way. It wasn't that she didn't feel the weight of the torment. It was just that she had learned to bury it. She had learned to turn the pain inward, to fold it neatly in the corner of her mind, where no one could see it, where no one could touch it. She told herself that as long as she kept it hidden, it didn't matter. If she was invisible, the cruelty couldn't reach her. But in the weeks leading up to that fateful day, the cruelty became harder to ignore, harder to bury. It wasn't one thing that set Emma off. It wasn't a single comment or a specific action. It was the cumulative weight of years of relentless abuse, both subtle and overt, that broke her. The way they laughed at her when she fumbled during a presentation in class, the way her name was always the last one called when group work was assigned, the quiet, insidious way they pushed her to the edge of every conversation, leaving her to fade into the background like an afterthought. She had never been a part of any group, not the popular kids, not the nerds, not even the outcasts. She existed in the margins, a shadow that no one noticed unless they were mocking her for one reason or another. And yet, it wasn't until the viral video surfaced that Emma realized how deeply the wound had cut. It wasn't just the mocking comments or the whispered insults in the hallway that had hurt her, it was the video. The video that was passed around the school like wildfire. A cruel spectacle that Emma would never be able to erase from her mind. It wasn't the first time she had been humiliated. There had been countless instances over the years, too many to count. But the video was different. It was a betrayal. It wasn't just her classmates laughing at her behind her back. It was a public display of their cruelty. The video had been taken in the cafeteria, a place where Emma had always eaten alone, at the corner table by the windows. She had kept to herself, as usual, lost in the pages of a book, or staring out at the street beyond. But this time, the kids who sat near her, the ones who never paid her any attention, decided to make her the center of their twisted joke. They had filmed her, unbeknownst to Emma, as she tried to eat in peace. The video wasn't particularly spectacular. There were no outrageous moments or shocking gestures. But it captured something far worse. The way Emma looked when she didn't know she was being watched. The vulnerability, the awkwardness, the quiet desperation of someone who just wanted to disappear. And disappear she did. They posted it online, and it spread across social media like wildfire. At first, it was a harmless joke. People snickered, shared it with friends, added their own comments. But as the video gained traction, so did the cruelty. What started as laughter quickly escalated into mockery, insults, and mean-spirited comments. Some had even made it into memes distorting her face, adding captions that reduced her to nothing more than a punchline. Freak and loser became her new labels, the ones that stuck to her even when she wasn't around. Her classmates began to see her not as a person, but as an object for ridicule. She had become the joke. The worst part wasn't that people laughed at her. It was that they felt entitled to do so. They didn't even hesitate. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that she had been minding her own business. To them, she was a target. They weren't even ashamed of it. They had no fear of reprisal, no concern for the pain they were inflicting. The cruelty of it all made Emma feel smaller, more insignificant than ever. She wasn't just an invisible face in the crowd anymore. She was the punchline of a joke, and the world was laughing. For days after the video surfaced, Emma couldn't escape it. Everywhere she went, someone was talking about it. She could hear the hushed whispers as she passed between classes. She could see the sidelong glances and the knowing smirks. She couldn't go anywhere without hearing someone make a reference to the video, to her, to the mockery. It gnawed at her, eating away at the little piece she had left. It didn't matter that she tried to hide from it, to shut herself off from the world. It was everywhere, in the hallways, on social media, in the lunchroom. The video had given her tormentors a voice, and now they had the power to make her suffer, to make her feel the weight of their disdain every second of the day. She stopped going to lunch. She stopped going to class early, so she wouldn't have to walk through the hallways and endure their laughter. She stopped speaking to anyone. There was no point anymore. She had become a spectacle, an object of ridicule, and it made her sick. The thought of facing them, of enduring another day of the relentless mockery, was unbearable. Each passing day felt like a repeat of the last. She saw the same faces, heard the same jokes, felt the same disgust. No one cared. No one saw her as human anymore. They saw her as something to laugh at, to make fun of, to crush beneath their collective heel. And as the days wore on, something began to shift inside Emma. The humiliation, the constant mockery, the feeling of being trapped, each of these things began to twist in her mind, to fester. It wasn't just that they had hurt her. It was that they had stolen her voice. They had made her into a joke, a puppet, to be pulled around by the strings of their laughter. It was as though her existence no longer mattered, except in how it could be used to entertain others. She had no control over her own narrative. She wasn't allowed to be anything other than the punchline. As the torment continued, a dark thought began to form in the recesses of her mind. What if she could make them see her? What if, instead of fading away, she made them notice her in the most extreme way possible? What if she could show them how it felt to be small, to be invisible, to be powerless? The thought was fleeting at first, a passing notion that she quickly pushed aside, but it lingered, gnawing at her, growing more insistent with each passing hour. The idea was dangerous. It was monstrous, but it felt, for the first time, in a long time, like a way out. And so Emma's anger and humiliation began to crystallize into something more, something she could no longer ignore. The hurt had transformed into a burning desire for control, for recognition. She had spent years being silenced, dismissed, ignored, but now she would make them see her. She would make them remember her. The thought settled deep within her chest, like a seed taking root, and Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The breaking point had come. The line had been crossed. There was no turning back. The days after the video went viral blurred into an endless cycle of torment for Emma. Each morning, she awoke to the same oppressive silence, a gnawing sense of dread settling in her chest as soon as she opened her eyes. The walls of her room, Her sanctuary felt like a cage now. At first, she had retreated into her books, into the virtual worlds she created in her mind, trying to escape into anything that wasn't real. But nothing could drown out the noise that filled her head. Whispers, laughter, snickers, all coming from every direction. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop hearing their voices. The video had given them a face, a voice. It had made her real in their eyes, but in the worst way possible. The more she tried to withdraw, the more she found herself suffocating. At school, the weight of their eyes on her back was almost unbearable. She couldn't walk down the hall without hearing the quiet snickers or feeling the uncomfortable gaze of her classmates, following her every move. She wasn't a person anymore. She wasn't Emma Monroe. She was the girl in the video, the girl who had been humiliated for everyone's amusement. There was no escaping it. The other students talked about her as if she weren't even there, as if she was some object to be examined, dissected, and laughed at. Emma couldn't remember the last time anyone spoke to her like she was a human being. By the time the third day passed since the video had gone live, Emma had stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria. The stares, the cruel whispers, the comments about her eating alone, they were too much to endure. The cafeteria was filled with the sound of chatter, the clinking of trays, the laughter that sounded more like a punch in the gut every time she heard it. She couldn't take it. She started slipping away to the empty stairwells, hiding in the narrow space between the lockers and the bathroom. She became an expert at slipping through unnoticed, weaving in and out of spaces where no one would bother her. In her own mind, it felt safer there. At least in the shadows, she didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. No one could see her, and that was the only relief she could find. But the isolation only deepened the sense of despair that had begun to consume her. Each day, Emma felt further and further removed around her. It was as though the walls of her school were closing in on her, the hallways becoming narrower, the noise more oppressive, the faces more sinister. She could feel the eyes of her peers on her, even when they weren't looking. In class, she sat at the back, her eyes cast downward, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She tried to focus on the lessons, but it was nearly impossible. Her mind wandered, always returning to the same dark thoughts. The video, the laughter, the endless ridicule. It filled every corner of her thoughts, leaving no room for anything else. Her world had become a nightmare that she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. Her phone, once a tool for her to connect with the outside world, had become a source of torment. The notifications, the comments on her posts, the screenshots of the video that circulated endlessly in group chats, it never stopped. Every time she looked at her screen, there was something new, a new meme, a new comment, a new message from someone who was laughing at her, someone who had shared the video or added their own snide remark. She had once found solace in social media, a way to escape from the pain of her real life, but now it felt like a constant reminder of her humiliation. Every notification was a jolt of anxiety, a reminder that she was a joke, an object of cruelty. Her parents didn't notice. They never did. Her father was always locked in the garage, buried in his car repairs or his tools, lost in his own world. He would grunt when Emma walked in, barely looking up from his work. There was no real communication, no connection. If Emma had ever tried to talk to him about what was happening at school, she doubted he would have understood, or worse, cared enough to listen. Her mother, on the rare occasions when she was home, was too wrapped up in her own struggles to notice Emma's suffering. The soft hum of the television in the living room was the only company Emma had when her mother was there, and it wasn't much of a comfort. Her mother's presence was nothing more than an empty, distant echo. Emma had learned long ago that there was no point in trying to reach out. No one cared enough to listen. The isolation continued to deepen. Emma began to skip classes, avoiding the places where the other students would gather. She didn't need the lessons. They no longer mattered. She had stopped caring about anything that had once interested her. Books, art, history, everything felt pointless now. She didn't belong in that world anymore. Her teachers didn't notice either. They went on with their lessons, their lectures, oblivious to the fact that one of their students was slowly slipping away from them, vanishing into a space that no one could reach. The only time anyone spoke to her was when they needed her to complete an assignment or take a test. Even then, the interactions were cold and perfunctory, devoid of any warmth or recognition. Emma had become a ghost. And then there were the dreams, the only place where she could escape the overwhelming pain of her waking life. At night, when the darkness of her room wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, Emma would close her eyes and let herself drift into the silence. But even in the dark, even in the sanctuary of her own mind, there was no peace. Her dreams had become nightmare-shrouded by the faces of those who had tormented her, the faces of the classmates who had laughed at her. They crowded around her in her sleep, reaching out to touch her, to pull her back into the reality she couldn't escape. The faces of the students, twisted into masks of cruelty, would always appear. They would laugh. They would call her names. In these dreams, she was always running, always trying to escape, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't get away. It was in this state of isolation, in this suffocating quiet, that Emma's mind began to change. The anger that had once been buried beneath the surface of her quiet exterior began to twist and grow, fed by the constant rejection, the endless isolation. She had always been quiet, always kept to herself. But now, silence felt like a prison. It felt like a trap. She had been silent for so long, and it had done nothing but make her invisible, make her a target for their cruelty. Emma's isolation was no longer just a state of being, it was a slow, gradual surrender to the darkness that was consuming her. Every day she spent in that silence, every moment she spent alone, the world outside growing louder and crueler, she could feel her resolve hardening. She wasn't invisible anymore. No, she had learned something. She could be seen. They would see her. And when they did, they would remember her, not as the girl they had laughed at, but as the one who had taken control of her own story, no matter the cost. The walls that had confined her for so long were beginning to crack. The isolation, once a defense, was now a weapon, and she was ready to use it. She closed the drawer softly and turned away from the dresser. Her eyes went to the window, where the moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost idyllic in its stillness. She wondered if anyone would hear the screams tomorrow. She wondered if anyone would care. But that thought, like all the others, was fleeting. It didn't matter. Emma went to her bed and sat down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She could feel the calmness spreading through her, filling every inch of her being. She wasn't nervous, not in the way that most people would be before such an act. She had already detached herself from the emotions that would typically be tied to something like this. She wasn't doing this because she was angry. She wasn't doing this because she was sad. She wasn't even doing this because she wanted revenge, not in the traditional sense. Emma was doing this because, in her mind, it was the only way to take control, to make a statement, to make sure that she was never ignored again. As she sat there, her thoughts turned to the morning. It would be like any other day, at least, for them. They would go through their routine, laughing with their friends, texting on their phones, making plans for the weekend. They wouldn't know what was coming, but she would. She would be the one to make the first move, to take the first step. And once she did, there would be no turning back. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last, until eventually, Emma felt the heaviness of her eyelids. She had to sleep. She had to rest, even if it was just for a little while. Tomorrow would be long. Tomorrow would be the day that everything changed. Tomorrow would be the day she made them see her. But even as she lay down, her mind continued to race. The last lingering thoughts before sleep took over were not of fear or doubt, but of certainty. She had made her decision. She had chosen her path. There was no going back. And in the silence of the night, Emma drifted off to sleep, her body heavy, but her mind alert. Tomorrow was coming. The morning dawned cold and still, a gray fog lingering in the corners of the sky, as if nature itself hesitated, uncertain of what was to come. Emma had woken before the alarm rang, her body already stiff with the tension that had been building inside her for weeks. The quiet moments before the storm were always the hardest, and today felt no different. She didn't feel the usual rush of adrenaline, the thumping heart she had expected. Instead, she felt numb, cold, detached, as though her body was merely a vessel carrying out an inevitable task. She dressed quickly, moving in a mechanical rhythm that no longer required thought. Her uniform, the standard black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, felt like armor. She had worn the same thing countless times before, but today, it seemed more like a uniform for war than for school. She ran her fingers through her hair, her reflection in the mirror an unfamiliar blur of skin and features. The girl looking back at her seemed distant, as if the Emma she once knew had already faded away, leaving this empty shell behind. She didn't bother with breakfast. Her stomach churned, but not from hunger. She had barely eaten in the past few days, surviving on an unhealthy cocktail of stress and sleepless nights. She didn't care. She didn't need food. What she needed was what she had planned for so long. The house was eerily quiet. Her parents were still asleep, the house unchanged, as if it were any other day. The thought should have made Emma feel something, guilt, perhaps, or hesitation. But it didn't. She simply moved, packing the bag with the things she'd prepared the night before. Everything was there, just as it needed to be. The gun, the ammunition, the spare magazines. She checked it one last time, her fingers lingering on the cold metal. It felt right somehow, even if she couldn't quite explain why. The bus ride to school was a blur. Emma sat in her usual seat by the window, staring out at the passing streets, watching the world move in its usual way. People were getting on and off the bus, oblivious to the change that was about to unfold. No one looked at her. No one knew her. And for the first time, she found peace in that. No one knew anything about her, and that made it easier to keep the facade intact. They wouldn't know what was coming. They wouldn't know who she was until it was too late. When the bus arrived at school, Emma lingered a moment, longer than usual. She waited for the crowd of students to disembark, their chatter and laughter drowning out the stillness in her mind. They were all so carefree, so unaware. It made her sick. It made her feel like she was suffocating beneath the weight of their indifference. They would never understand what she had gone through. They would never know how their cruelty had shaped her, how it had driven her to this point. She wouldn't let them forget. She couldn't. The halls were crowded with students rushing to their lockers, laughing with friends, trading gossip. Emma moved through them like a ghost, unnoticed, unseen. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, each step taking her closer to the inevitable. The school day hadn't even fully begun, and yet she already knew how it would end. She had made her plans so many times in her head that it was impossible to forget. Every movement, every step, every action had been rehearsed. She passed by the cafeteria, the laughter of her peers bouncing off the walls, and felt a pang of disgust. It was all so casual, so lighthearted. They didn't know that for some, every moment in this place felt like an eternity of torment. But Emma wasn't here to be a part of their world anymore. She had already detached herself, severed all the ties that once bound her to this place. No one had ever truly seen her. No one had ever cared enough to ask, to look beyond the surface. And now, they wouldn't have the chance. By the time Emma reached the school's main entrance, she knew she was running out of time. She could hear the bell ringing in the distance, signaling the beginning of the first class. There were still a few moments of quiet before the chaos would begin, and Emma spent them in the bathroom, the cool tiles beneath her hands steadying her as she breathed deeply. She could feel the weight of the bag against her shoulder, its contents pressing against her, reminding her of what she was about to do. Emma stood there for a moment, staring into the mirror. The face she saw was both hers and not hers. She didn't recognize the girl staring back at her, the coldness in her eyes replaced by something sharper, something darker. She could feel her heart beating now, but it was steady, like the tick of a clock, counting down the final moments. This was it. There was no turning back. She moved towards the stairwell, where she had planned her first move. It was quiet, the hallway empty, except for a few lingering students. She watched them pass, her breath shallow, her grip tightening around the strap of the bag. They would be the first, the ones she had to face. She didn't know who exactly she would target first. It didn't matter. They all deserved it. They had all been a part of the story, a part of the cruelty that had driven her to this point. As she ascended the stairs to the second floor, she felt her pulse quicken. She had to act fast. The hallway at the top of the stairs was always busy, full of students switching classes, walking in groups, rushing to avoid being late. The noise of their laughter and chatter filled the air, oblivious to the quiet danger that had entered their midst. Emma was aware of every detail: the hum of the fluorescent lights, the scuff of shoes against the floor, the distant sound of lockers slamming shut. She pulled out the gun from the bag, her hands steady as she gripped it, feeling the cold weight of it in her palms. She could hear her heart pounding now, but it didn't feel like fear. It felt like anticipation. It was the feeling of finally being seen, of finally having control. She had become the predator, and they were the prey. The years of suffering, the years of silence, all of it had led to this moment. She would not be ignored anymore. Not today. Not ever again. Emma took her first step forward, her eyes locked on the students ahead of her. They didn't see her coming. No one did. But they would. They would feel her pain, her rage, her desperate need to be noticed. She had chosen this path, and nothing would stop her now. Not the flashing lights of security cameras, not the cries of those she would leave behind, not the silence that would soon fall over the halls. Emma was in control now. The first shot rang out, loud and clear, echoing down the hallway. The world reacted swiftly, as it always did when tragedy struck. News outlets picked up the story within hours, the horror unfolding across every screen. The images of blood-stained hallways and the frantic faces of survivors seared into the collective consciousness. Social media exploded, flooded with posts, hashtags, and cries of disbelief. Words like shocking, unbelievable, and senseless trended for days, a fleeting attempt to process the unfathomable. But beneath the shock and the outrage, there was something darker, something more insidious. The coverage was relentless, a constant loop of breaking news and footage, each moment dissected, each detail scrutinized. Parents, teachers, students, experts, everyone had an opinion, a theory, an answer to the question that loomed in the air like a toxic cloud. Why? Why had Emma, the quiet girl no one had noticed, done something so monstrous? In a world desperate for answers, they turned to speculation. Was it bullying? Mental illness? The culture of violence that permeated schools? Some blamed the easy access to weapons, others pointed fingers at social media and the toxic, unfiltered world it created. Yet, no one truly understood the depth of the pain Emma had endured. Her motives, her reasons, were buried beneath a tidal wave of blame, fear, and confusion. The school, once a place of routine, now stood as a monument to fear. In the days following the attack, the building was sealed off, police swarming the area as investigators combed through every inch for clues. Survivors were interviewed, their accounts fragmented, each story a jarring contrast to the life they had known. The memories of that day were seared into their minds, the sounds of gunshots echoing in their ears, the faces of the fallen frozen in time. Some students were hailed as heroes for their quick thinking, but no one felt like a aeronaut when everything had changed in an instant. The victims' families were left to navigate the abyss of grief, their sorrow compounded by the knowledge that they would never fully understand what had driven Emma to such extremes. For them, their loss was both personal and public, as every detail of their loved ones' deaths was laid bare in the media. Some of them were offered condolences, others forced to endure the probing questions of reporters desperate for a soundbite. The world grieved with them, but it was a distant grief, fleeting, replaced quickly by the next headline, the next tragedy, as if the world was simply moving on. Across the nation, conversations about gun violence, mental health, and the state of schools flared up once again. Politicians promised change, spouted the same rhetoric they always did, but nothing concrete seemed to come of it. For a while, The conversation was intense, passionate even, but eventually, it too faded into the background, becoming just another statistic in the ongoing fight for solutions that never seemed to arrive. The school itself would never be the same. It became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, a place of unhealed wounds. The students who had survived lived with a collective trauma that would haunt them for years to come. Some tried to move on, to pretend it hadn't returned to normal. But normal was a concept that had shattered the moment the first shot rang out. No one could escape the shadow of that day. The teachers, too, were left to grapple with their own sense of failure. They had failed to notice, failed to intervene, failed to protect. And Emma? In the wake of the devastation, the world had moved on from her story. It wasn't about her anymore. Not really. The media's fascination had already begun to fade, her name just another footnote in the catalog of horror. There was no closure, no understanding, no attempt to truly comprehend the quiet, lonely girl who had taken so many lives. Instead, she became an enigma, a cautionary tale. Her face, once an indistinguishable blur among the crowd, was now burned into the memories of those who watched it unfold. But even her face, captured in the stillness of the aftermath, faded as the world spun forward. In the end, it wasn't about the victims or the reasons why. It was about the next tragedy, the next story, the next person to slip through the cracks, unnoticed until the damage was done. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all.